Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. The room felt too small for the weight of what was about to happen, every inch of the dimly lit study vibrating with years of betrayal, power plays, whispered threats, and broken loyalties as Michael Baldwin stood rigid near the desk, his arm extended, his hand unerringly steady around the cold metal of the gun pointed directly at Victor Newman's head. And though Victor had stared down enemies his entire life, corporate raiders, blackmailers, kidnappers, traitors, even death itself, there was something different in Michael's eyes tonight, something hollow and resolved, something that made even Victor's ironclad confidence hesitate for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction was enough to let the truth flood the room like poison gas. Because this wasn't business, it wasn't strategy, it wasn't a calculated move on a chessboard, this was personal. This was the final reckoning between two men whose lives had been bound together by ambition, loyalty, fear, and moral compromise for far too long, and Michael's voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, carrying the cadence of someone who had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in his mind, not out loud but in the quiet moments when guilt crept in, when the faces of people he had hurt for Victor flashed before him in the dark, when the justification stopped working and the weight of his choices became unbearable. And he told Victor that he had spent years convincing himself that he was different, that he was the exception, that he could serve the monster without becoming one, that he could cross lines and still claim a conscience, that he could bury evidence, twist the law, destroy lives, and still sleep at night because he told himself it was for family, for survival, for loyalty. But standing there now, gun aimed at the man who had demanded everything and given nothing but conditional approval in return, Michael admitted that the truth was simpler and uglier. That he had been afraid of losing Victor's favor, afraid of being cast aside, afraid of what would happen if he ever said no. And Victor listened, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating even now, even with death inches away. But Michael wasn't finished, because this wasn't a negotiation, it wasn't a plea, it was a confession and a sentence all at once, and he reminded Victor of every secret he had cleaned up, every crime he had helped bury. Every innocent person who had paid the price while Victor walked free and powerful and untouchable. And for the first time Victor tried to interrupt, tried to assert control, telling Michael this was madness, that he was emotional, that this wouldn't end the way he thought it would. But Michael cut him off, his voice rising just enough to crack the armor in Victor's tone. And he said that was the problem, that Victor always believed there was another move, another escape hatch, another pawn to sacrifice, and tonight there wasn't. Because Michael had finally understood that the only way this ended was with someone taking responsibility, real responsibility, not press conferences or payoffs or carefully worded denials, but consequences. And as he spoke the room seemed to close in, the shadows stretching like ghosts of the past, and Victor's eyes flickered, not with fear exactly but with recognition, as if he saw in Michael the mirror of all the men he had created and discarded over the years. And Michael stepped closer, the gun never wavering, the distance between them shrinking until Victor could see the tremor in Michael's breath, could hear the raw emotion beneath the controlled delivery. And Michael told him that he had lost friends, lost pieces of his soul, lost the man he thought he was supposed to be, all in service of Victor's endless hunger for control. And he asked Victor if it had ever been enough, if any of it had mattered, if loyalty had ever meant more than usefulness, and Victor didn't answer. Because there was no answer that could save him now. And that silence was louder than any confession, and Michael nodded slowly, as if that confirmed everything he needed to know. And he said that for years he had believed the lie that Victor Newman was inevitable, unstoppable, larger than life, but standing here now he saw the truth, that Victor was just a man, a dangerous one, yes, but still a man who had built his empire on fear and manipulation, and men like that only stayed powerful because people like Michael let them. And his voice softened then, almost regretful, as he said he was sorry. Not sorry for what he was about to do, but sorry it had taken him so long to stop. And Victor finally spoke again, his voice sharp, demanding, telling Michael to put the gun down, to think about his family, his career, the law, reminding him of everything he would lose. But Michael shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips, and said he had already lost it all piece by piece. And this was the first choice he was making that felt honest. And then the air changed, the moment crystallized, time slowing to a painful crawl as Michael took a breath, his finger tightening on the trigger, and he looked Victor Newman straight in the eyes, not with hatred, not even with anger anymore, but with finality. And he spoke 3 words, each one falling like a hammer, clear and deliberate and irrevocable, words that carried every ounce of his regret, his resolve and his release. Words that marked the end of their twisted alliance and the beginning of the consequences Victor had avoided for a lifetime. Words that echoed in the room even before the shot rang out. Words that Victor would hear forever if he survived them. And as Michael said them, the world seemed to hold its breath, the gunshot exploding like thunder, shattering the silence, rewriting everything, and in that instant, before the smoke cleared, before bodies fell or stood, before sirens or screams or aftermath, there was only the truth of what had been done, a single, irreversible act born of years of silence, fear, and complicity, and whether Victor Newman lived or died in the seconds that followed almost felt secondary to the fact that for the first time, someone had finally stopped him, not with a lawsuit or a threat or a deal, but with accountability written in blood and sound in 3 final words that would haunt Genoa City forever. The next chapter began in the echoing aftermath of the gunshot, a sound that refused to fade, ricocheting through the Newman study and embedding itself into the walls, the floor, the air itself, as smoke curled lazily from the barrel of Michael Baldwin's gun and his arm finally trembled, not from doubt but from the crushing realization that the point of no return had been crossed, and Victor Newman staggered backward, the force of the impact driving him into the edge of the desk, crystal, rattling, paper scattering like startled birds, his breath leaving him in a sharp, involuntary gasp as his hand flew to his head and came away slick with blood. And for a split second the great Victor Newman looked exactly like what he was in that moment. Not a titan, not a legend, not an untouchable kingmaker, but a wounded man fighting gravity, fighting pain, fighting the collapse of the myth he had spent a lifetime building. And Michael watched it all with hollow eyes, the gun lowering slowly as the weight of what he had done pressed down on his chest, his ears ringing, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might shatter his ribs. And yet there was no relief, no triumph, only a vast, echoing silence inside him where fear and loyalty and obedience used to live. And Victor's knees buckled but he did not fall, not yet, because survival was stitched into his DNA, because even now his mind was racing, cataloging damage, calculating odds. And he grabbed the desk to steady himself, his breath ragged as he lifted his gaze back to Michael with something that might have been fury or might have been disbelief, as if the universe itself had violated an unspoken rule by allowing this to happen, and he snarled Michael's name like a curse, demanding answers that no longer mattered, demanding control that was already slipping through his fingers, and Michael took a step back, not in retreat but in surrender to the inevitability of consequences, his voice finally breaking, as he whispered that it was over, that there were no more deals, no more cleanups, no more lies to tell himself. And Victor laughed then, a harsh broken sound that turned into a cough, blood flecking his lips as he told Michael it was never over, that power didn't die with a bullet, that Genoa City was built on men like him and broken by men like Michael who mistook guilt for justice, and even wounded, even bleeding, Victor radiated defiance, a refusal to accept that this chapter could ever truly be his last. And somewhere in the distance alarms began to wail, Newman's security responding to the chaos, footsteps pounding, radios crackling, and Michael realized with a strange clarity that the world was already moving forward without him, the machinery of consequence grinding into motion, and he placed the gun gently on the desk, a symbolic gesture that felt both meaningless and necessary, as Victor slid down into the chair behind him, his strength finally giving way just enough to force him to sit, his breathing shallow now, controlled through sheer will, and he stared at Michael with an intensity that cut deeper than any shouted threat, telling him he had made a fatal mistake, that mercy was a currency Michael no longer possessed, and Michael nodded, accepting that truth without flinching, because this was never about mercy, it was about ending something that had poisoned them both. And the door burst open then, security flooding the room, weapons drawn, shouting commands that blurred together, and Michael raised his hands slowly, compliance coming easily because resistance would have been a lie. And as they moved toward him, Victor barked orders through clenched teeth, demanding an ambulance, demanding silence, demanding loyalty even now, and the men obeyed because that was the habit of power, because Victor Newman's voice still carried weight even as blood soaked into his collar, and Michael was pulled away, handcuffs snapping cold around his wrists. And as they let him out he looked back one last time, meeting Victor's gaze across the wreckage of the room, and in that look there was no hatred left, only a weary acknowledgement of what they had been to each other and what it had cost. And Victor held that gaze too, burning it into memory, already rewriting the narrative in his mind, already planning survival, retaliation, legacy, because if Victor Newman did one thing better than anyone else it was endure. And as the doors closed and sirens grew louder, Genoa City stood on the brink of a reckoning it could no longer postpone, because word would spread, whispers turning into headlines, alliances fracturing, enemies emerging from the shadows emboldened by the sight of blood on Victor Newman, and families would be forced to choose sides, to confront truths they had ignored for years. And Michael, sitting in the back of a police car with flashing lights painting the night in red and blue, felt the first strange flicker of peace cut through his terror, not because he believed he was free, but because for the first time in his life he had stopped running from who he was and what he had done. And as the car pulled away, carrying him toward judgment, Victor Newman was rushed toward survival, and between those two paths, the road to accountability and the road to power preserved at any cost, the future of Genoa City cracked wide open, raw and exposed, waiting to be written in the blood, secrets, and consequences that would follow. The next chapter unfolded not with answers but with shockwaves, rippling outward from the moment Michael Baldwin was driven away in handcuffs and Victor Newman was rushed into emergency surgery, because Genoa City did not know how to exist in a world where its most powerful man had been shot by his most loyal defender, and that uncertainty seeped into every boardroom, every living room, every whispered phone call before dawn, as sirens faded and rumors ignited. And inside the hospital the air was thick with antiseptic and dread, Nikki pacing like a caged storm, her heels striking the floor in uneven rhythm as doctors spoke in careful tones about trajectories and swelling and critical hours, while Victoria stood rigid, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached, her mind already racing through implications she refused to voice, because fear was a luxury she could not afford, not now, not when Newman Enterprises trembled on the edge of chaos, and Nick, hovering between fury and disbelief, replayed the impossible image of Michael Baldwin holding a gun to their father's head, struggling to reconcile the man he trusted with the act that had shattered everything. And across town phones rang unanswered as alliances shifted in silence, because those who had built their fortunes under Victor's shadow suddenly wondered whether that shadow was lifting or deepening. And in the police station Michael sat alone in an interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent light flattening him into a man, stripped of narrative and excuses, his hands still trembling slightly as if the echo of the gunshot lived in his bones. And when the detective finally asked why, the word hung in the air like a challenge, and Michael closed his eyes, seeing not Victor's blood but years of compromise stacked like evidence against himself. And he said simply that he couldn't do it anymore, that he had crossed a line he could not uncross and the only honest thing left was to stop. And the detective scoffed at the simplicity of it, because Genoa City thrived on complicated motives, but Michael didn't elaborate, because no explanation could carry the full weight of what he had been. And back at the hospital hours crawled by until a surgeon finally emerged, exhaustion etched into his face as he announced that Victor was alive, stabilized for now, the bullet having grazed rather than destroyed, and relief crashed through the family in uneven waves, Nikki sobbing, Nick exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, Victoria closing her eyes for a single, private moment before the next phase began, because survival did not mean safety, and as Victor lay unconscious, machines humming steadily, the battle for control ignited without him, executives circling like wary predators, each move cloaked in concern but sharpened by opportunity, and Victoria stepped into that storm with steel in her spine, issuing orders, sealing access, asserting authority with a calm that brooked no challenge, because weakness would invite destruction, and yet even as she projected strength she felt the ground shifting beneath her, because Michael Baldwin knew everything, and whether Victor lived or died, that knowledge was now a loaded weapon pointed at the Newman legacy. And as night fell again Victor stirred, consciousness returning in fragments, pain slicing through him as reality reassembled piece by piece, and the first name he rasped was Michael's, not in fear but in rage, because betrayal burned hotter than the wound itself. And when Nikki urged him to rest he ignored her, already plotting, already framing the story in his mind, a version where he was the victim of madness, where Michael was a traitor undone by weakness, where control could be reasserted through punishment and example. And across town Michael lay on a narrow cot in a holding cell, staring at the ceiling as the enormity of what he had unleashed finally took shape, because this was not an ending, it was an ignition, and he wondered whether the truth he carried would ever see daylight or be buried under Victor's relentless will to survive. And in that uncertainty he found a strange resolve, because whatever came next, trial, prison, retaliation, he would not take another step backward into silence. And as dawn crept over Genoa City, painting the skyline in muted gold, the city woke to headlines that would fracture loyalties and expose long-hidden sins, and somewhere between a hospital bed and a jail cell 2 men lay awake, bound by a single violent moment, each convinced that the war was not over, only transformed, and the next move would decide not just their fates, but the soul of Genoa City itself. The night refused to release its grip on Genoa City as the truth spread like a slow-burning fuse, and by morning the air itself felt heavier, charged with fear, curiosity, and the unmistakable scent of a power shift, because Victor Newman was alive but wounded, and that distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit, as doctors whispered about recovery timelines while lawyers whispered louder about damage control, and Michael Baldwin, alone behind cold bars, felt the city moving without him, reshaping itself around the violent choice he had made. A choice that replayed endlessly in his mind not as the gunshot but as the moment before it, when he understood there would be no absolution waiting on the other side, only truth and consequence intertwined, and across town Nikki sat beside Victor's hospital bed watching his chest rise and fall, torn between relief and dread, because she knew that survival only sharpened his instinct to retaliate, not to reflect, and when Victor finally opened his eyes fully there was no confusion in them, only fury crystallized into purpose, as he murmured that betrayal would be answered, that loyalty would be tested, that no one would be spared scrutiny, and those words rippled outward, reaching Victoria as she stood in the Newman boardroom facing executives who pretended concern while calculating advantage, her voice steady as she asserted control, knowing hesitation would invite annihilation, while Nick wrestled with a quieter war, torn between rage at Michael and the haunting realization that some part of what he had done rang uncomfortably true, and in a stark interrogation room Michael was offered deals, sympathy, pressure, all of it sliding past him as he stared at his hands and accepted that this was the cost of finally stopping, of choosing accountability over obedience, and as dawn broke, headlines ignited screens and whispers turned into arguments, alliances cracked, enemies emerged emboldened by blood on Victor Newman, and yet beneath the chaos ran a deeper tremor, because secrets long buried now felt dangerously close to the surface, and Victor knew it, plotting from his bed with the same ruthless clarity that had built his empire, determined not just to survive but to dominate the narrative, while Michael, stripped of power but anchored by resolve, prepared himself for the storm ahead, knowing that whether he was silenced or exposed would shape everything that followed. And as the city moved forward, on uncertain ground, one truth settled inescapably over Genoa City. The shot had not ended a war, it had merely announced it, and nothing, no family, no fortune, no legacy, would emerge untouched.